Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from today. As the American Baptist Home Mission Societies, our partners in mission stretch from Alaska to Puerto Rico and everywhere in between. And we welcome you from your town to today's town hall on faith and activism. My name is Jennifer Sanborn, and it is my privilege to open the doors, so to speak, to today's conversation on the intersection between faith and civic engagement. As our planning team prepared for today's discussion, guided by the leadership of Reverend Kadia Edwards, we had our own robust discussion on what we think civic engagement is. Is it voting and working to ensure others' voting rights? Of course. And the images of people standing in line to participate in early voting certainly brought this home for me as I looked last night. Is civic engagement volunteering or participating in service learning? Of course, this is a door that opens many of us to civic life. Is it putting our time, talent, and treasure behind someone who's running for public office? Or perhaps, and I hope some of you are considering this who are listening today, running for office ourselves? Yes, it is all of this and more. It seems simple, uncomplicated when we consider just the civic engagement part of the equation. We share a common life and we act individually and together in all kinds of ways for the public good, for public purpose. As we put our fingers to the pulse of our religious communities, however, we could feel the tension that inevitably arises when we consider the intersection of our faith and civic engagement. For those of us who consider ourselves Baptist, the separation of church and state is our religious DNA. Many of us inherited notions of faith as private and civic engagement as public, with the only unsettled intersection perhaps where the edge of the United States flag brushes against some church altars. Yet in these same meeting houses, many of us grew up praying, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." I hear public implications in these words that we pray day after day, week after week. Do you? The waters at these intersections of faith and civic engagement are muddy. And I find myself coming to this conversation today longing for them to stay that way. Or borrowing from the title of a book co-edited by one of our panelists, perhaps I come hoping that the waters will be further troubled by today's conversation, for me and for all of you who have joined us. For I believe that it is in such waters that transformation occurs. It is in such waters that the false binaries of private and public, inner life and outer life dissolve. It is in such waters that we are washed of our complacency. It is in these troubled waters that we stand in the now and we work for the not yet of this creation that God so loves. In order to be shaped by these troubled waters, my friends, we need to remain in them. So I invite you to set aside whatever might distract you from being fully present and attentive to the wise ones who have gathered here today. If you're like me and you have 52 different tabs open, just minimize, set the phone aside, bring your mind, your heart to join your body for today's conversation. I invite you to dedicate your time and your focus to a named or unknown ancestor who fought for access to the public realm, or perhaps to a single member of a future generation whose life on this planet will be possible because of your faith-inspired civic engagement. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. I'm now delighted to introduce my colleague and friend, Reverend Brittany Graves, who will pray for our gathering today. Thank you.
Hello, all. If you could bow your head and join me in prayer. Creator God, thank you for this space and this time that we have come together. Many of us gathered eager to listen, to learn, and to lean into this conversation of faith and activism and civic engagement. Bless the creation of this town hall in an opportune time where it feels like it matters now more than ever. Bless the panelists and the speakers and the words that they will share and the questions that they will answer and the experience that they are able to share with us today. Bless the participants and all that hear, that we may be engaged and discern the ways we can continue to show up now and in the days ahead. Let us recognize the way God is speaking and moving and breathing in this world and within us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Now
Thank you, Reverend Brittany, for that powerful and meaningful prayer. I am Marilyn Turner Triplett, and I lead our Ministries of Healing and Transforming Community. And on behalf of our Executive Director, Dr. Jeff Hagray, our Board of Directors, our staff, and our leadership, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to tell you that each of you play a significant role in advancing the Home Mission Society's ongoing commitment to heeding Christ's call to activism. In the precarious and uncertain times that we're living in, your voice, your actions, your prayers, and your presence have tremendous transformative power. I'm going to take just a few moments and share a little bit about what you can expect to experience during our time together today. First, we have an excellent technical team working with us to ensure that we have a smoothly run event. But if you should encounter a technical difficulty that you can't resolve, for example, if you get disconnected and you can't get back in, please call 610-768-2425 and or email us at itsupport@abhms.org. Now, this information was included in that reminder email that you received just about an hour or so ago. But again, if you'd like to jot it down in the event of a technical difficulty that you can't resolve, please call us on 610-768-2425 or email us at itsupport@abhms.org. Today's event is part of a series of similar ABHMS hosted events that are designed to engage audiences like yourselves who are interested in faith-based activism, social and prophetic justice matters. So please keep an eye out for information that will be coming your way via email and social media about these events. If you find that you enjoy today's experience, or you see opportunities for improvement, or you just know of related issues that you'd like to see us address in the future, please let us know. Following today's gathering, we're going to be sending a brief survey to the email that you provided when you registered, and we're hoping that you will take a few minutes to complete the survey when you receive it. It's important because your responses are one way that your voices speak into these series. And we promise to do our best to listen and use your feedback to enhance the content and quality of these engagements. In a moment, I'm going to be introducing our panelists, an esteemed group of activists who will be sharing their unique perspectives in a session that's going to be facilitated by Reverend Katia Edwards. For the 80 minutes or so while the panelists are speaking, the question and answer feature will be open. During that time, we encourage you to submit any questions or comments you may have for the panelists. Now, because of the large audience that we have with us today, and we're very grateful to each and every one of you, we may not be able to get to every question, but we will certainly do our best to address as many as possible. But do keep in mind as well that in some cases, the panelists may answer the questions as they speak. After our time with the panelists has concluded, the question and answer feature will be closed. Immediately following the panelists, you're going to be hearing from Dr. Robin Stoops, who serves as the Executive Minister of American Baptist Churches in Nebraska, and he's going to be leading us in a faith and activism call to action. We'll then hear a brief but powerful testimony by Ms. Anita Fenner-Bennett, followed by a prayer and a 5-minute video that we know you're going to enjoy. ABHMS's own Reverend Ben Sullivan will then close us in prayer. So let's meet today's panelist. Dr. Randy Woodley, PhD, a legal descendant of the United Katoa Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma, co-host the Piecing It All Together podcast. He is an activist, scholar, distinguished speaker, teacher, and wisdom keeper who addresses a variety of issues concerning American culture, faith, spirituality, justice, race, diversity, regenerative farming, our relationship with the earth, and indigenous realities. His expertise has been sought in national venues such as Time Magazine, The Huffington Post, and Christianity Today. Dr. Woodley is an author and currently serves as Distinguished Professor of Faith and Culture and Director of Internal and Indigenous Studies at George Fox University, Portland Seminary. Let's welcome Randy.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here this morning.
Claire Davidson Frederick is a faculty fellow in the College of Bible and Ministry at Lipscomb University, where she teaches Bible and ministry and directs the Engage Youth Theology Initiative, a public theology and racial justice institute for high school students. She spent 15 years as a professional singer, songwriter in the Nashville music industry and taught songwriting workshops at the Tennessee Prison for Women. She co-planted All Saints Church in Nashville, Tennessee, and she serves as their lead worship pastor. Her sermons have been featured in prominent books and journals. A graduate of Rutgers University and the Hazlitt School of Theology at Lipscomb University, she is a Doctor of Ministry candidate at McCormick Theology Seminary in Chicago. Let's welcome Claire.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Cristina Maria Hernandez holds a Master of Social Work from Boston University and is currently in her final year of pursuing her Master of Divinity at the Boston University School of Theology. She has experience working with and supporting asylum seekers and domestic violence survivors in Boston, Massachusetts. She has also worked as an interfaith community organizer for economic justice, advocating for worker and immigrant rights in her hometown of San Diego, California. She has been a contributor to a series of posts from students at Boston University that are featured in Everyday Theology. And her article, La Posada Sin Fronteras, makes it abundantly clear that Cristina is a gifted writer and a woman on the move. She's someone to watch. Let's welcome Cristina.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Reverend Adam Russell Taylor is President-elect of Sojourners and author of Mobilizing Hope, Faith-Inspired Activism for a Post-Civil Rights Generation. Taylor previously led the Faith Initiative at the World Bank Group and served as Vice President of Advocacy at World Vision US and the Senior Political Director at Sojourners. He has also served as the Executive Director of Global Justice, an organization that educates and mobilizes students around global human rights and economic justice. Taylor is a graduate of Emory University, the Harvard University School of Government, and the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology. Go Samuel DeWitt Proctor. Taylor is ordained in the American Baptist Church and serves at the Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Let's welcome Adam.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Reverend Dr. Marie Onwubuari is Regional Executive Minister of ABC Wisconsin, a trainer, consultant for intercultural transformational leadership, and co-editor of Trouble the Water, a Christian resource for the work of racial justice. Most recently, the Office of the General Secretary of ABC USA has called Marie to serve as the Associate General Secretary of Mission Resource Development of the American Baptist Churches USA. Her current interests are creating opportunity for and accountability to constructive conversations across difference and helping people find and commit to a place and voice in the work of racial justice, particularly in the church and in the local community. Let's welcome Marie.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a joy to be here.
It's now my pleasure to welcome our panel facilitator, Reverend Kadia Edwards.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner Triplett. My name is Kadia Edwards, and I serve as the National Coordinator for Volunteer Mobilization and Disaster Response Ministries. Today, I have the pleasure of moderating this timely and much-needed panel discussion. To the panelists, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for your willingness to share with us today, and we look forward to hearing and learning from you. To begin, I would like to start with you, Claire. What is the responsible connection between faith and civic engagement?
Thank you, Reverend Edwards. Well, I think people of faith, particularly pastors and ministers, we must stay involved in conversations and activities that affect our communities, particularly the more vulnerable or marginalized people in our communities. And it's a tricky balance because on one hand, we're called to be a pastoral presence in the midst of strife and discord, and that means speaking words of healing and comfort over people who are hurting and traumatized, obviously. But on the other hand, we're called to speak prophetically to those in power, who have the ability to change systems and structures of injustice that affect people's lives in very real and tangible ways. I don't remember who said it, but religion, and by inference, religious people, should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So that's been a mantra of mine, knowing when to speak and how to speak and to whom to speak and what to say involves a level of spiritual discernment. And hopefully that type of discernment I think it can only be done well in community with others. So surrounding yourself with allies, folks who have a similar vision to yours for justice, folks who can encourage you when it's hard and who have your best interest at heart, that's important. The work has to be done in community. And we have to have that balance of prophetic speech and pastoral comfort for our communities.
Thank you, Claire. And at this time, I invite Adam.
Thanks again. It's an honor to be with you all. I'll build a little bit on what Claire just shared, because I do think that the combination of the prophetic and the pastoral is critical. What I would emphasize is that there is an inextricable link, inextricable connection between faith and civic engagement. And I know that everyone on this program may be Baptist, but I'm going to speak as a Baptist because I'm a proud one. And I think as Baptists, but this is true of Christians more broadly, we have a couple of particular stumbling blocks when it comes to this connection. I believe strongly in the separation of church and state. I'm a big fan of Roger Williams and his legacy to not only the Baptist church, but to the country. But the separation of church and state does not mean or require the segregation of faith from public life. Mm. And there are kind of two pitfalls that I see that we grapple with. One is, and I say this in my book, Mobilizing Hope, as two aliases that we've created for Jesus. One of which is that Jesus was somehow apolitical. It is a huge misreading of scripture to de-radicalize Christ, to not put him in his proper political, economic, and social context, to realize that he was a poor Palestinian Jew who challenged the authorities of his time, both religious leaders, but also broader authorities, government authorities even. And so I think, this kind of apolitical challenge is a real one. And the challenge with it is that if we really do believe that Jesus is Lord, then Jesus is Lord over every sphere of our lives. And that includes our economic, social, and political lives. And therefore, following Jesus, embracing the gospel, has profound political implications. So that's kind of number one. The other danger is that we end up kind of only embracing what I call a privatized Jesus, where faith becomes primarily about that personal relationship with Christ. In other words, we have an anthropological understanding of the gospel and not enough of a sociological understanding, that our personal relationship with Christ calls us and lists us in God's purposes in the world, which include a commitment to hesed, to tzedek, and mishpat, a commitment to justice, steadfast love, and righteousness. And so if we're truly going to be a follower of Jesus, then we have to be engaged in the work of justice, of righteousness in the world around us. So the last thing I'll just say then, based on these kind of two misnomers, is that engagement in civic life and in civic activism is not an add-on or extracurricular activity of faith. It is a core requirement of faith and Christian discipleship.
Thank you so much, Adam. At this time, I would like to extend an invitation for Marie to answer the question.
Thank you, Reverend Kadia, and to ABHMS for this invitation and for inviting a wide variety of voices and perspectives on this topic. Appreciate what the panelists have already said. I think it's helpful for me as someone who's always trying to find my way in the dominant narrative to kind of start with a basic definition. So my connotation of civic is understanding that there are social systems that operate within and by a certain set of expectations and boundaries. Those are defined by explicit laws, rules, codes, services, procedures, but also a series of implicit values, norms, ways of making meaning and engaging with others. And those social systems can be formalized as we know them as boroughs, districts, cities, counties, states, etc. Many of us growing up in the United States know these entities. And I want to acknowledge that even more fundamentally, social systems can be understood as things as basic as extended families, literally our neighborhoods, our villages, and for our purpose today, our faith families. And in both these formal and informal connotations of social systems, it calls for a recognition that the system is made up of people and their actions, both historic and ongoing. And engagement comes into play when individuals go beyond just passively participating in what others have formed and are forming, but rather they take up the responsibility to learn about and connect with those various levels of expectations and boundaries, both explicit and implicit, and they find ways to contribute to and serve toward the common good. So for me, my understanding of civic engagement starts with my cultural context in which my Christian faith was formed. My starting point is the social system, is the community. My identity and purpose of life from a cultural perspective is defined by belonging to and being responsible to a community. And in my upbringing, that community was immediate family, extended family, and literally the neighborhood in which we lived. And the order of the priority changed based on the needs of the moment. And integral to that sense of responsibility was both a love for and indebtedness to country, both my country of birth and the motherland of my parents, which is the Philippines, and to the United States, the country we immigrated to. And there's a whole complexity of global colonialism that comes into play, but perhaps that's for another panel. So engagement in these systems is learning about and connecting with the expectations and boundaries, explicit and implicit, of all of these social systems, and finding ways to contribute to them and serve toward the common good of all people. For me, it's synonymous with living out and into a cultural system that puts community, not self, at the center. Now, where faith comes into play for me starts also at the beginning of being raised in my case, an American Baptist church, during its transition from a Euro-American congregation founded in 1900 into a predominantly post-1960s global East and South immigrant church. And in this context, I did not learn about the gospel of social justice, but I did consistently see and experience the gospel of radical hospitality. And along with that, the exhortation to be good stewards of the gift that God has given to each one of us for the use of, again, the common good. So this faith formation proved to be a fertile ground for me then, and in ministerial vocation, as I began and continued to fill out my biblical and theological understanding of active faith. Two texts that come to mind when I think about civic engagement is one, the Great Commandment. Jesus says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind." For me, this means serve God with all that we have, all that is available and accessible to us, both internally, the gifts that God has bestowed us with, as well as externally, the privileges, the resources, the opportunities that God has given to us. And that's very much tied into the immigrant journey that I've experienced. Jesus goes on to say, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Again, drawing upon my fundamental understanding of social system, it's starting where you are, right in your neighborhood, your barangay. It doesn't matter if you're a new member or you're an old member of that community, you now have the agency to contribute to the fabric of that society. And for me, loving your neighbor starts with radical hospitality. That's the faith formation in which I was reared. And then engagement develops as you learn about and connect with the expectations and boundaries of that neighborhood, how all of these impact the common people, even if those people, those inhabitants, those citizens are in continual flux and being expanded each day. The second scripture that comes to mind comes from 1 Peter, 2nd chapter, and I'll be 9 through 17 are the verses, and I'll just highlight a couple of the verses taken from the Message version. God's instruments, we are chosen to be God's instruments to do his work and speak out for him, to tell others of the night and day difference he has made from nothing to something, from rejected to accepted. Goes on to say, friends, this world is not your home, so don't make yourselves cozy in it. Again, I hear my immigrant journey in there. Verse 13, make the master proud of you by being good citizens. Exercise your freedom by serving God, not by breaking the rules. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Respect the government. What I've come to understand is that respecting the government, recognizing its influence, but also its influencers, and revering God means recognizing the agency that God has bestowed us with so that we consider ourselves one of those influencers. So for me, that also is an indication that faith calls us to civic engagement.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Marie. And Christina, I'll invite you to share.
Yeah, I definitely echo a lot of what's been said. I definitely believe that my faith and civic engagement are one and the same. I think to add to what folks have been saying, I don't see a commitment to social justice or civic engagement as a calling, an individual calling. I think that in different faith communities that I've been a part of, it's been seen as like, oh, that's your thing. That's the thing that you're passionate about. I believe that as a follower of Christ, any follower of Christ, that that is our calling collectively to engage. And I also think that it's an outpouring of my beliefs and my belief in the inherent dignity and worth of every human. I think that that's just an outpouring of those core beliefs. And I think, to speak to even the how it isn't an individual calling, I think that some folks get intimidated because they feel like maybe they're not good at being out in public protesting, or maybe they can't vote, maybe they don't have the ability to vote. There's so many ways that we can be civically engaged, which I imagine we're going to hop into in the rest of this dialogue, but there are so many creative ways to be civically engaged and to use the power and privilege that you have to advocate for those who don't have that same privilege and power. And I'll go ahead and pass it on to Dr. Randy.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, so this question is only coming up because of, and I agree with what all the panelists have said. I love what's being said, and we could actually talk about this probably for the rest of the panel. But Maria mentioned colonialism and said maybe that's a discussion for another time, but I think it's a discussion for now because we have to understand why we are even asking this question. And I believe why we're asking this question is because through the colonial patterns that have been set, Christianity has come to our shores with an innate Western dualism, a Platonic dualism that separates what we do from what we believe. And so now we're actually, when we watch the life of Jesus in scriptures, when we understand all the things he said, all the things he did, the story of how Jesus came as a marginalized person, lived with marginalized people, spoke of a kingdom that was not just a new kingdom, but it was new and old. And that old part was the whole, what I call the Shalom, Sabbath, Jubilee construct that goes really from Genesis throughout the rest of Scripture. And Jesus is saying, hey, there is something about providing safety nets for people who are marginalized, disenfranchised. In the Old Testament, of course, it's the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, those who don't have a place in society. That is sort of the core of the kingdom message that Jesus taught. And he said things so simple like, love your neighbor as you do yourself. And what do I love about, I prefer myself, right? I prefer to be clothed. I prefer to be fed. I prefer to have a roof over my head. All of those kinds of things. It's a pretty simple thing when it boils down to it. But because of our Platonic dualism, this separation of between the material and the ethereal, or the mind and spirit and the body and earth and all those things, we end up trying to create doctrine and trying to create a system that allows us to rationalize why we don't actually do what Jesus said. Now, it's pretty clear in Scripture that Jesus says that we're to treat everybody this way. And it's also pretty clear that it's not something where one just takes it in privately. You can't help your neighbor privately. I love that scripture in John. How can you love God who you haven't seen and not not love your neighbor who you've seen? These are all reinforcing this idea of that we have to make sure structurally and systemically that everyone is taken care of, everyone in our community. And Shalom's this wonderful construct, right? It's like if half the community is fed and half the community is hungry, nobody has Shalom. It's about all of us together. And the only way in our particular system that we can all come together, loving our neighbors, providing for our neighbors, helping the disenfranchised, the marginalized, doing what Jesus said to do, is to be involved in our civic engagement, to be involved in every way we can. And so we have to be, as followers of Jesus, social innovators wherever we are. We have to, whatever the need is, wherever Shalom is broken, that's where we have to place ourselves. And we can place ourselves in a lot of different ways. So I think I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you, Dr. Randy, appreciate it. Just a reminder for those of you who are watching and listening to the webinar, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A, and we'll make sure that the panelists have an opportunity to answer before the end of the discussion. And I will now ask the second question to the panelists and ask that you do mutual invitation to those who are participating. And the question is, how do you engage your faith with civic engagement? How do you engage your faith with civic engagement? And Randy, I'll start with you.
Oh, okay. I was just getting warmed up, so I appreciate that. So, my wife Edith and I, we are co-sustainers of something called Elahe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elahe Farm and Seeds. And we've created and host an atmosphere of schools and just hospitality and influence, if you will, so that people can actually come and sort of get teaching, experience ceremony, experience getting their hands in the dirt and kind of getting in touch with the earth, because for us, this is the major existential concern that we have for our grandchildren and those beyond. And so we're putting all of our efforts right now into earth justice and trying to get the earth, the rights of Mother Earth and take care of that. But also during the COVID crisis, the quarantine, we've not been able to do as much. We continue to mentor people, we continue to influence, we continue to teach, we do influence on social media, through my books, through my courses that I teach, et cetera, et cetera. But we really like to be more involved. And in the past, we've done sort of every kind of service that you might want to think about, especially in our Native communities. We're actually probably the most disenfranchised people in America. And so we've served through any number of areas, through justice areas, through, houseless service, through unwed mothers and teens, teen pregnancies. We've served through food programs and feeding programs and on and on and on. And so whatever the need of the community called for, we've tried to answer that wherever we've been. And so, so we have, 30 plus years doing these things, and we could go into any one of them over the years and, how it worked. But right now I'm predominantly, as I have to sit behind my computer for almost everything, a influencer and a teacher. And so, we're kind of limited right now. So it's a bit frustrating, but, we continue on and wait for the day that we can actually get face to face with a whole lot of people again. So. And let's just call on Claire.
Thank you, Randy. So as I think about how I engage my faith with civic engagement, there's some obvious ways, which is just, going to abolish ICE rallies with my friends who are involved with immigrant rights, or showing up for prayer vigils after mass shootings, or going to marches with Black Lives Matter friends and activists after a police shooting. And putting myself in spaces with interfaith practitioners who are also involved in justice work. But more organically, my activism happens in my teaching and in my mentoring of young people, and kind of playing off of what Adam said about, telling the story of Jesus in a way that's not been told, right? My students say, I believe in Jesus, but it's, which Jesus? And so in my undergraduate Bible classes and in the Engage initiative, for example, my work there involves just getting young people to catch a bigger, more holistic understanding of what the gospel is, of who Jesus is. That, the gospel is more about, it's more than simply me getting my individual sins forgiven so I can go to heaven when I die. I always tell my students that's an individualized, spiritualized, partial gospel, but that's not the whole story of Jesus. The gospel, as Adam was saying, that Jesus preaches, my focal text for how I teach Luke is Luke 4:18-19, and I call that Jesus' mission statement in the synagogue sermon. And so that statement is about recovery of sight for the blind, and good news for the poor, and freedom for the prisoners, and justice for the oppressed. It's about Jubilee ethics and economics and canceling debt, This is gospel work in the here and now. with real concrete implications and not just pie in the sky when you die. And so to be Jesus people or good news people, we need to care about the same things that Jesus cared about. And Jesus cared about people's bodies. So I emphasize that Jesus healed people's bodies. Jesus cared about people's social situations. When he healed people, he also restored them to community, and brought people who were previously invisible and living on the margins in his society to the very center of God's story. And so we too need to center the stories of the marginalized and the minoritized among us. I think of the woman of the city, you know, that anointed Jesus' feet in Luke 7, and he flips the script and shows Simon, the so-called expert in the law, that there is something that Simon needs to learn from this woman. You know, that's the pedagogy of the oppressed, right? Mainly Simon needs to learn what it means to love much. And so I tell this, it's in how I tell the story. Meeting Jesus changes folks. You know, when Zacchaeus meets Jesus and decides to pay back all the ill-gotten money that he's extorted from people, we might call this reparations, right? Jesus says, today, salvation has come to this house. And not only Zacchaeus' salvation, but also the salvation of the community, who hopefully will no longer be cheated by this man. So salvation in that story has communal implications. It has monetary, financial, economic implications. And so for my students who are business majors at Lipscomb, I will say, go and do likewise. You know, when you start your business, treat your workers ethically, justly, pay a living wage, and healthcare, you know. That's the holistic work of Jesus. And so the church can't shy away from that work. That is our calling too. His mission statement should be our mission statement. And I invite Adam to speak.
Thanks, Claire. I feel like you were preaching there, so appreciated it. I'm going to tell just a little snippet of my story to answer this question. So my parents got married to each other in 1968. It was a very controversial decision at that time. My mother's Black and my father's white. They were married the same year that interracial marriage was legalized across this country through Loving versus Virginia Supreme Court decision. And as many of you probably know, it was the same year that Dr. King was tragically assassinated. And so when I was growing up, they instilled in me a deep and abiding belief that I was made in the image of God. I had a kind of clear understanding of Imago Dei, even though I didn't know those words at a very young age, but also that my generation, Generation X, inherited the unfinished business of the civil rights struggle. And that was not just about civil rights, it was also about economic justice, and later became about trying to combat mass incarceration and police violence. And the one piece of that broader agenda that I never could have imagined that my generation and other generations would still have to be fighting for is the basic but fundamental right to vote. And so I'm going to describe a little bit about the work I'm doing now, but I'm going to kind of focus on that particular piece because it's a huge part of what we're focused on and what I think all of us should be committed to doing as followers of Jesus. So in my work at Sojourners, and if you're not familiar with us, we're a Christian peace and justice organization that's been around for almost 50 years. We'll turn 50 next year and hope you'll be a part of some celebratory activities and events, hopefully in person, but virtually if need be. But we're an organization that's both a publication, we have a magazine, and we have a digital publication that you can check out at sojourner.net. But we also are a mobilizing organization. We have been trying to equip the church to engage in justice work. And for us, our tagline has always been faith in action for social justice. So we work on a range of different issues and have campaigns on environmental justice, on criminal justice issues, including racialized policing. We work on poverty, both in the United States and around the world. We work on peace issues and much more. But in the last 3 years, we started a partnership with the National African American Clergy Network, which is led by Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, out of a deep and alarming concern about the rise of voter suppression tactics, particularly targeted at the Black community, but also targeted at brown communities as well in many parts of this country. These voter suppression efforts really became exacerbated in 2016 when the Supreme Court essentially gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and took out the pre-clearance piece of that legislation. And there's been a significant rise in voter suppression tactics across many parts of the country, but particularly in the South and the Midwest. What that means in practice is purging voter rolls. It means moving polling sites at the last minute. It means intimidation and disinformation campaigns at polling sites and beyond. It means ending early voting in many states. It's kind of a whole range of things. And now the COVID crisis has added a whole nother layer of challenges to our upcoming election. I think, and we think, it is a core matter of faith and discipleship to protect every single voter and every single vote. That really should be a faith imperative. It's also an imperative for the health and integrity of our democracy. We should all want to see that happen in order to have legitimate elections and to be able to maintain the health of our democracy. I'm happy to go into the Q&A time in more detail about what specifically we're doing, but we have an initiative called Lawyers and Callers Turnout Sunday, where in 9 key battleground states, we are equipping Black churches in particular, but also engaging many other allies, white churches, multiracial churches, Latino churches, and others, to engage in education and advocacy efforts to try to prevent voter suppression from happening in this upcoming election. And now we are kind of gearing up to come alongside lawyers and have clergy provide a moral presence at voting sites, both to be able to report back on any voter suppression that is happening, but partly kind of triggered by the president's very reckless and alarming remarks, particularly in the last debate, where he essentially told a white supremacist group to stand by and to engage at polling sites and monitoring. Clergy are going to be critical for trying to de-escalate situations, and just their very presence could actually prevent violence from happening at polls. And so I really feel that our democracy is on the ballot, and clergy can and should play this critical role of ensuring that every single voter who is made in the image of God is able to vote and hopefully does vote in this very consequential election. My bad. Let's turn it to Christina.
Awesome. So I think when I am participating in civic engagement, that I am like just engaging my faith, and I feel closest to the divine when I am speaking, marching, creating. I'm an artist as well. Doing all of those things makes me feel closest to God. And I think specifically back to a march that I helped organize and participated in a few years ago now, but it was in San Diego County. It was done with a bunch of interfaith organizations, labor organizations, in support of janitor women who were mostly immigrants, and of those immigrants, mostly undocumented. And so these women organized this march, and they decided that as a symbol for them, they wanted to carry a cross over their shoulders as they marched. And marching with them, I felt like I was living into my life calling of just being present, marching beside, following behind these women. I wanted to share this quote because it's just so powerful. So there's a Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched at Selma and had this to say about that experience. He wrote, "For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship, and I felt my legs were praying." And so I think that there is also, just to share a little bit of my personal story as well, there's something so deeply spiritual and profound in in doing those things for me, especially because I think it also connects me to my ancestors. And I was doing organizing work for a while, and it wasn't until after I began doing that work that I learned that my grandmother had marched with Cesar Chavez, and that my great-grandmother was a revolutionary woman who carried a pistol between her breasts, rode a horse, and protested to protect indigenous lands in Mexico, where she was from. And so I think for me, it also connects me to my ancestors and connects me to this kind of greater calling. And I do believe that as people who identify as Christian, we are also a part of a tradition. We're also part of that revolutionary tradition. We come from a tradition that speaks truth to power, and we come from a tradition that proclaims freedom to the prisoner. And I believe that that is very literal. I believe that we're not proclaiming just a spiritual unshackling or freedom. We are proclaiming a physical freedom for those who are currently imprisoned and currently oppressed by the systems that we interact with on a daily basis. And just to echo to what Adam was saying about the power of clergy presence, I myself, I don't think I'm going to become a minister. I say that now, who knows? But there is so much power in having clergy present for those kinds of actions. I have seen it in the work that I've done. There have been moments where maybe a hotel is exploiting their workers in really horrific ways, and lots of labor organizations organize protests, and it's just like meeting a wall. And then we roll up with a bunch of clergy, rabbis, imams, pastors, ministers, priests, and suddenly it becomes the sacred moment. And there's this fear and reverence of, we're in trouble. And so I have actually been able to witness those really powerful moments of having faith communities come forward and speak out, calling out injustice in those ways. And so I think for me, it can be so many different things. It can be, voting and marching, but it can also be creating art for the movement. It can be caretaking and taking care of the kids of those who are out there marching. It can be so many different things. Can I go ahead and pass it on to Dr. Marie?
Thank you, Christina. As was mentioned in my introduction, I am here in Wisconsin. I'm located just outside of Milwaukee, first ring suburb. And though it was my vocational call that brought me to Wisconsin, I think I'll answer this question more from a civilian, so outside of my formal role as a faith leader here. And I'll share an example of something that's still quite young, quite new, because I resonate with people who are trying to find their way in the work, and I'm not quite sure what they can do. And it's kind of bittersweet because, as Dr. Turner also said, we'll be moving away from Wisconsin. So I'm sad to be moving away from this group of folks that I've been working with for the past several months. So for me, it really began, I've been here just over 6 years, and starting with just noticing where my family was located. So our new neighborhood, building on what I spoke about earlier, starting where you're located, and noticing how we felt different, how I felt different. And we live in a predominantly white, affluent suburb, not far from our office. And so it was a neighborhood that was new to my experience growing up in very metropolitan areas on the East and the West Coast. And so tried to be very present to and mindful of where I was experiencing what I mentioned earlier, hospitality, radical hospitality, or not experiencing hospitality. And that found my way into areas in the community where there were international populations, and noticed some good activity there. And so it really just began paying attention, as I mentioned, to what were the expectations and the boundaries of the new neighborhood that I was part of, this new social system, and trying to find my place, my family's place in it. And so that led to particularly looking at our school district and noticing areas where there were some white normativity that didn't quite fit my family or that were rubbing against our own values, and paying attention to opportunities where cross-cultural conversations and relationships needed to happen, where instances of racial bias was playing out. And so just being present to those and leading to opportunities of some teaching and training opportunities within the school district and among parent networks in our neighborhood. And so that has been over the years, and wanting there to be more and trying to find out who are the other people in the community that were concerned about this and passionate about it, and kind of hitting a wall, you know, with not finding that community yet. And then 2020 happened. And then all of a sudden, you know, we were having protests in our little suburban neighborhood. And student and alumni groups were advocating to the school district about curriculum revisions, and testimonies about racial injustice and bias were coming out. And so there was this moment earlier in the summer where there was all of a sudden this openness that broke open. And it was through the relationships that have been developed over time. And I want to mention the relationships because I think it's so important in activism that you are grounded in relationships and building upon those along the way. A colleague of mine was able to, who came to me and said, what more can we do? What more can we do even beyond the school district? And we talked about a multi-sector effort. How do we talk about racial justice in our community across the sectors of our city and of our district? And it just began with a group of 12 of us. You know, we were like, well, who do we know? Who do we know have been trying to work on this and are passionate about it and are open about it? And throughout the summer, we met as a small group. It wasn't faith-based, it wasn't a church group, but it kind of felt like it. And oftentimes I had to stop myself from starting our meetings with prayer because it wasn't a prayer meeting, but they knew where I was and that all of this was coming out of my faith. And that has still developing, but it's developed into just a group of residents that have come together that says, we want to be about working toward racial equity and inclusion by bringing people together through education, conversation, and creative solution finding across all sectors of our community. And envisioning a dynamic, multicultural suburban community that recognizes, welcomes, and values the strengths and contributions of all of its people. And at times it's been like, okay, let's just get to action. But the work of bridge building and finding where people are on their spectrum of understanding their own sense of activism takes time. And so we are just beginning to perhaps launch our first official event as a group. And that's just doing a follow-up conversation to an event that a community partner brought. And he's an expert in the greater Milwaukee area, talking about the history of segregation, of racial segregation in Milwaukee and beyond, and putting a call out to suburban families on their role in a different future. And that was an excellent program. And all we're doing is saying, okay, people, what is our responsibility now? What are some actual next steps we can take? And so we'll be facilitating those conversations. So that's just one example, Reverend Katie, of how I'm trying to live out faith in community. And it at times feels like a very small way, but I think it's a way that tries to honor that everyone has a role in the engagement of their community. And that hopefully will lead to approaching our local government, which there have been examples of that kind of brewing, approaching the candidates that are on the ballot about what their vision is for our community, looking at the practices of our local businesses and how they're working towards racial equity in our neighborhoods. Police department too, looking at the people that are concerned about how policing has been done. So it's just opening up more conversations of various ways to get involved. And while I will be leaving them, I will be rooting them on and perhaps find a new community to start that where I'm going. So that's good.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So there are a few questions that are directed to individual panelists, and so I want to start with one of those questions. And Claire, this question is directed to you, and the question reads, can prophetic effectively compete with evangelical prosperity preaching? And prophetic preaching can alienate some communities and cause disharmony. What is the response of those who advocate for prophetic voices?
Read the first part again. Can prophetic preaching compete
with evangelical prosperity preaching?
Probably not. I mean, people want what they want from a church, right? And so kind of the consumerist nature of the American church is happy to give them what they want. I just did a unit on the cost of discipleship. We were talking about Luke 9 and where Jesus says, you know, what the costs are of following him. And I had my students watch a documentary on Bonhoeffer and how the cost of for him of speaking out against the Nazi regime was his life. And that following Jesus authentically and faithfully usually leads to a cross. So, you know, I know people in my denomination who've gotten fired for speaking out against racism. Our congregations are congregationally autonomous. Their preachers are hired by elders and they can be fired at will. And so I know ministers who've gotten fired for speaking out against racism or for becoming too political. The way I've solved that at my church is I don't get paid. My church plant, there's no paid preachers. So we have lay preachers who come talk to us every Sunday, and I line those people up. And these are preachers who, as Karl Barth would say, preach with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, and they get real and relevant really quick. And they can do sermons that are honest and convicting without fear of reprisal. That's not the case in all churches. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is for people who whose churches have a wide range of views, of political views in one church. It's got to be hard, but I think, you know, we still have to preach the truth in love. We can do it in a way that is faithful to the gospel, but that still convicts people. And I mean, Jesus never promised that following him would make us rich and successful. You know, in fact, he said just the opposite. The world will hate you as they hated me. So don't be surprised when that happens. But I think in our American culture, we want, you know, kind of our religion to be just a balm that solves all our problems, and it doesn't. You know, following Jesus is difficult. He never said it's going to be easy. So I think we got to be honest with people. I'm honest with my students about it. You know, I'm not going to candy coat it for them. So I don't know, but I'm not paid to preach. So again, I'm in a position where I don't have to necessarily worry about what I say and how that's going to come back on me. I'd love for someone else to answer though, if they have an idea.
I'd love to jump in if that's okay. So I completely agree with Claire that following Jesus requires sacrifice, and often you can experience persecution and it's not easy, but I wouldn't cede the ground too quickly to the prosperity gospel. I think we have to be crystal clear. The prosperity gospel is a perversion of the gospel. It converts God into a heavenly ATM machine. It is almost entirely transactional about what I can get from God. And it, at worst, conditions God's grace and favor on people tithing or doing certain things. And that is just a severe perversion of what grace looks like and what grace means. And so I think in addition to all the things Claire talked about, I think we also have to be really vocal about Jesus' promise of abundant life. And that abundant life won't necessarily look like prosperity in the way the prosperity gospel preaches it, but it will look like purpose and meaning and relationship and community that is at the heart of what the gospel looks like in practice. And so, you know, the text that I really hold on to tightly on this is actually from one of the prophets, is Isaiah 58, that describes the kind of religious worship that God wants from us. And it's kind of critical of just going through the motions of religious worship. And the prophet Isaiah says that when we feed the hungry and we break the yokes of injustice, then our light will shine like the noonday, and we will become repairs of the breach, restorers of streets with dwellings. And what's so beautiful about that text is it's not just the poor and the oppressed that are blessed. It is saying that our wholeness and our abundance is tied up in the wholeness of others. And so to me, if we could convey that gospel, I actually think it would outcompete, in a sense, the prosperity gospel, but we've got to preach it boldly and we've got to preach it faithfully.
All right. Well, thanks so much for that answer. Randy, I'm going to direct the next question to you because it is specifically for you. The question is, you have lots of example of mercy, and there's quotes around mercy, towards neighbors. What actions are related to federal policy regarding Native Americans, etc.?
So that's a really complex question, because there's been an intentionalness to convolute Native American law so that we can never get anything done. And so if you want to understand bureaucracy, just try reading Native American law. But it all boils down to sort of a, I know right now a lot of denominations and organizations are repudiating the doctrines of discovery. And, but basically, doctrine of discovery is that which said that if you're from a Christian European country, you can land on the shores of a quote unquote undiscovered country. And if those people aren't Christian, then you can subjugate them, you can convert them, or if you have to, you can even kill them. And that's sort of the history of the ugliness that carried over, and it ended up coming into popular movements in America like Manifest Destiny, etc. So, so when you have that is actually enshrined in American law, it's enshrined in a number of cases: Johnson versus McIntosh, the Oneida Nation versus the city of Sherrill, New York, and other places where the doctrine of discovery is upheld as law against Native Americans' sovereignty and Native American rights. We really don't stand a whole lot of chance. And so, you know, it's sort of like, you know, you heard probably read the paper, Dismantling the Master's House with the Master's Tools. You know, right now there's a lot of Native American tribes and others who are, you know, hoping that a lot of their smartest people become lawyers, right? I'm not sure if that's going to actually work or not. I am calling on the church, the people who are supposed to show justice and mercy and all those things, to actually take a look at America's most hypocritical stance, which is the idea that there is nationwide freedom and equity and all of that, and yet we won't deal with our own history against Native American genocide. And so if the church will wake up, if the church will get involved in justice initiatives at a grassroots level, we might see change. But those laws are actually made to just get us, they're made so that our people will spend millions and millions of dollars that they don't have, and usually not get reimbursed. But when a city or, you know, others end up spending that kind of money, a lot of times they get reimbursed. We've seen this over and over again against our tribes. If we could just sort of have a clear picture of justice, we might have a new beginning in this country. I think we have to start with Native American genocide, and then we have to deal with our enslavement of West Africans. And, you know, we've got some things to deal with if we're ever going to get on with the idea of equality and justice. So yeah, we're wading into, you talk about muddy waters, we're wading into really muddy waters when we talk about Native American law.
Thank you, Randy. I appreciate that. And so I want to invite the voices of all of the panelists with this question. How do we as practitioners impact and influence the nominal Christian who basically holds to embedded theology and deliberative theology? How do we influence them to embrace this type of conversations, which is holistic, genuine, and authentically the truth? And I would like to start with you, Christina.
So I've kind of gone through my own personal journey when it comes to this question, and I have served churches in doing just that and creating spaces for conversations around racial justice, around activism, and I got pretty burned in trying to meet in the middle with folks. And I think that at this moment, I want to speak for maybe my community, the people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, who are maybe outreaching to their church communities, and really just trying to engage them in what we're talking about. I think for me, I've decided that it's more effective for me to put my energy towards those who are already there, who are already committed and see that connection to their faith and doing the work. My energy is going towards my people, my community, who is impacted by the laws and the systems that we encounter. I think that there are definitely people who have the patience and the gifts to work kind of in between. I actually have a reconciliation minor from Seattle Pacific University, and that was my passion, was to bridge this gap. And I think because of being harmed so many times along the way, it's not for me anymore to do that work. For me, my work is now focused on the liberation of my people, and my work is now focused on educating folks on the policies that are being passed and going through. And I think somebody had mentioned in the this last panel, actually, that this isn't so much a moment of division, but a moment of clarification. And I definitely agree with that statement. I agree that this is kind of like the wheat from the chaff kind of a moment. And I think we're so far into this already. Things are so, they're so obvious, I think, in so many ways. The oppressions, the systems of oppression, that from my perspective, there's no more time. Like, we just need to move forward. And so I'm assuming not everyone agrees with that, but that's, from my experience, my personal opinion on that.
If I can jump in, I hear you, Christina. I feel you. I resonate with you as well. As someone who has embraced a call for bridge building, have at times been done with it. And so I think it's a matter of how do you get people to do their own work, to be willing to do the self work, to recognize the values that they are operating out of, and the things that they have bought into that are preventing them to see the urgency that Christina is talking about, and that they're seeing all across this country and the globe. I still believe in relationship. I still believe in finding the places where it hits at the heart. I think we have to be real about self-interest. where's the moment of self-interest that's going to make you care? Whether that's because you have a family member that's impacted, or whatever the case may be. I don't know if real altruism, if I really believe in that. You just do it for the common good. I think there is self-interest in everything. But finding that place where you are gonna get someone to look beyond themselves and take responsibility to educate themselves, because it is tiring to carry the burden to educate others. So I don't know, I don't have a more of an answer than that, but I think it's important to acknowledge the where it is on people, importance of self-care in this work, and the need for people to step up and take responsibility of what they've bought into, and to educate themselves to get them on board to make a difference.
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback on that, because I've seen that in my work with Reverend Edwards when we've worked together on the Engage program, and just the importance of white people educating other white people, and doing the work, not expecting people of color to keep shouldering that load in educating us. And so my role has been to seek to enlighten or educate white colleagues, white students about their privilege, about the historic injustices, to take students on this civil rights tour where we go down to Alabama and we visit EJI Museum, and we go to the lynching memorial, and we learn the history, and we hear the stories of people who were part of earlier movements, and then people who are part of present day movements. But storytelling is also a powerful, rather than trying to proof text somebody into changing, to hear their stories, right? Or to feature these stories that haven't been told. Brian Stevenson says the truth will set us free, but we've never told the truth in this country. So just putting my colleagues, my white students and others in a position where these stories can be heard and told. And again, just that veil be pulled back, because people don't know what they don't know. So that's my job as I feel like as a white person, is to be that encouragement for people to do their own work, to read these books. The stories are out there. The museums are out there. Let's go learn what we need to learn so we can move forward.
I would just add, one, I also really feel your fatigue and pain, Christina. And, bridges get walked over. So I definitely feel that. I am hopeful in the sense that I really see this moment we're in, particularly in light of the dual pandemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism and police violence, which fortunately, I think many people have been awakened to in some new ways. I don't know yet if that's going to be a sustained awakening and lead to real change, but I think that's up to us. But I see it as an apocalyptic moment. And I don't mean apocalyptic in the end times meaning, but in the original meaning of the word, which is really about an unveiling, a kind of revealing of the things already there. But because of the racial disparities that COVID has revealed, and because of the longstanding crisis and tragedy of police violence, people are more awake and attuned to what has been there all along. And so to me, it becomes a question and a test of discipleship. How does a church then disciple people more deeply to do the hard truth telling? Because there is no road to real reconciliation without a commitment to truth telling that Randy was referring to, and a commitment to building a radically more just American world. We can't get reconciliation without those two things, or a commitment to those two things. So how do we as a church help disciple people through their relationship with Christ into a greater commitment to doing that hard work? And I believe we can, but I think, and this may be a little provocative, but the rise of Trumpism, and I'm saying Trumpism very intentionally, not just the election of Trump, but the kind of rise of a politics that appealed to many of the worst sides of America, and to fear and to hate, and stoked a great deal of racism and xenophobia. that rise was a failure of Christian witness and of Christian discipleship. Would not have happened in the same degree if the church had been the church. And so I'm hopeful that we are going to be the church in 2020 and beyond. And again, these crises we're in now create this opportunity to reimagine and to rebuild, the kind of country that I think is much more in line with our Christian values and priorities, and ultimately, one that is about the beloved community.
I'm just going to chime in. It's a hypothetical question. It's a relevant question, but in a way it's hypothetical, because every one of those people the person who asked are coming from a different place. But I agree on a couple of matters. One is, truth telling. So we want to talk about, like, one of the things you always hear people talking about, we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We actually need a truth commission, and then we'll see where it goes, because reconciliation implies that there's an outcome that has to happen. So I think the dignity of people's voice and people's choice demands truth telling. And so, I proposed that we do a great listening conference across America. The other thing is that some of those people respond to, and almost everybody, I think, as a human being, responds to this story. So Claire mentioned our stories. We're five faces on the screen, but we all have stories, right? We all have costs that we've paid. We all have stories that people can relate to. And so, making room for that through, Claire mentioned hospitality, is one of the main things that I try to do, is to make room for those conversations on a personal level. They don't always work out, but once in a while they do, And the other thing I think is to create, I used to think that, if I had the largest voice, the largest platform, that I'd make the greatest change. And that's just not true. So what we've done is we've created, so to speak, a model that can be inspiring, and that people can go back in their own context, in their own situations, make change. And so I think we need a lot more of that. There's a lot of talk going on, right? And we all have important things to say, but the old adage, one picture's worth 1,000 words. And so just living this thing out in a way that people can see it is so important. So, and I think it's a very valid question. I'm not at all denigrating the question, but I think it has to be done on a ground level. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. And another question that I have for the panelists to answer collectively is, there are widely divergent perspectives around racial justice, voting accessibility, community activism, and such. How should we as Christians labor to de-isolate our conversations from one another? In other words, how do we dismantle theological and cultural echo chambers, when it comes to issues of faith and activism? And I would like to start with you, Marie.
I guess two things that come to mind is I keep going back to self-work. That's kind of my bias, and really being truthful about our own ego. I think one of the things that comes in the way of collaborating and recognizing that our own communities don't have the full answer, but that we can actually learn from what other people are doing, other people's stories and experiences, is our ego. We want to be the church, we want to be the organization, we want to be the group that is making the change, that's making the impact, that's going to make the mark. And I think we need to be real with ourselves about how much that drives us versus what our goal actually is of racial justice, of mercy, of the things of God. And I hear a lot of people pointing to that, but I don't see a lot of that changing. So I think, you know, self-work on an individual, but also an organizational or whatever group you're with, having real conversation and truth telling about how important it is for it to be us that's making the difference, as opposed to just working with others. I had another thought, but it's escaped me for a moment, so I'll pass to another panelist.
So one of the things that came to mind is that one of the kind of core theological beliefs and concepts that I mentioned earlier, Imago Dei, is truly an intersectional commitment and concept. And I think justice is intersectional. I know that's kind of a term that's been used a lot lately, particularly in more secular circles. But if you really, you know, take Imago Dei to heart, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that means that anything that assaults human dignity, anything that mars the image of God, anything that denigrates and dehumanizes that image is counter to our faith. It is assault on that image. And so I think it's a concept and a belief and a conviction that sometimes we underestimate and should really hold on to and apply in lots of different ways. One of the things that I think is important to emphasize is, you know, we as Christians do not have a monopoly on morality or on justice. That being said, we bring to the table some pretty powerful things, like the radical love ethic of Jesus, that even calls us to love our enemies, as hard and as uncomfortable as that is. I think it's absolutely necessary right now in particular. It could be an anecdote to some of the deep polarization that we see in our politics. It also enables us to sustain a lot of our activism because we hold on to eschatological hope that can enable us to overcome so much of the existential hells that we face around us. And so, you know, those are just a couple of examples of where I think we have these deep spiritual resources tied into our faith that we shouldn't take for granted and we should apply to our activism.
Randy, do you mind jumping in?
Katia, can you repeat that question? I'm not sure I got the depth of it.
Absolutely. There are widely divergent perspectives around racial justice, voting accessibility, community activism, etc. How should we as Christians labor to de-isolate our conversations from one another? In other words, how do we dismantle theological and cultural echo chambers when it comes to issues of faith and activism?
Well, got a lot to that question. One of the things that we have sort of fooled ourselves into thinking is that God is most active in our churches, right? And you know, the truth is that we've created a bubble that is probably in a lot of ways kept God out of our churches. And so I think we have to understand the whole community as a whole, and not just our churches. And when we do that, then those people in our communities end up getting to know us. They get to know the place. Now, I pastored in a Native community, an indigenous community, for 7 years. It was the only Native church within about a 50-mile range. I didn't pastor the church, I pastored the community, right? And so when you get to know people, they're not as likely to create those echo chambers against you or against what you're saying. You know, when you do their funerals, when you do their weddings, etc. And so, you know, this is again, it's very difficult to answer sometimes these hypothetical questions like, this is the prescription for everybody, because we're not all the same. We're all different, and everything requires different situations. So I'm just going to stick with this this idea that we have to know one another. This I think it was Marie, Dr. Marie, who brought up the idea of relationships, and this is what it's about. It's about knowing one another so that we don't have those echo chambers.
I want to add too, this is like an artificial environment we created with the Engage Youth Initiative, but part of what we do in the summer when we bring these young people together to have conversations around faith and racial justice particularly, you know, we've got kids from one side of the political spectrum, you know, a young man whose father is a law enforcement officer, and then we've got people over here who, you know, have seen oppression in their communities by police. And so, but we get them talking, we put them in spaces, and Reverend Edwards does a lot of great exercises with them about comfort zone and mainstream margin, and in what places are we privileged, in what areas in our lives do we experience privilege, and in what areas do we not. And sometimes that informs too where I see myself being able to take part in these conversations. If I have a certain level of privilege, I can go into a community and surrender that privilege for the sake of like a racial conversation. We've done work in churches where as a woman, I wouldn't be able to speak at that church. And so there are moments where I'm able to surrender that for the sake of like a conversation around race with a church. But there's other spaces where, you know, I wouldn't, someone who has been traumatized by a church, I wouldn't expect them to go in and have to listen to opinions that are hostile to them. I think that's hard too. But just to put ourselves in spaces where we can be outside our comfort zone and learn things we don't know about other people, and have conversations with people who are not like us, whether politically or religiously. You know, if we're strong enough in that moment to do it, and we're not, you know, putting ourselves into a space that's going to further traumatize us. I think that's been helpful for me, is to put myself in spaces where I'm outside my comfort zone.
I appreciate what you said, Claire, about, you know, prioritizing your own safety. I think that's super important in these conversations. And so one thing that I am thinking about is the fact that I think when someone is speaking truth, not everyone is going to be on the same page. You know, I think we're in a couple of you have already spoken to this, where our American Christianity is today, how it's arrived there. I mean, I think of like Sojourner Truth's speech, the Ain't I Woman speech, that was not received, you know, in a very like, oh, we see your humanity, like, let's work together. I think that is happening a lot today. And I think that it's a lot of these issues, unfortunately, that have to do with just human dignity and people made in God's image has become so polarized. And I have experienced places where my humanity is not seen or acknowledged, or that humanity of Black folks. You know, I've been to churches where there has been shootings, national news of Black men, and pastors go up and pray for law enforcement. You know, that's such a visceral example of this like polarization. And I think that it's not, in this moment in time with the issues that we're talking about, you know, this isn't just like political opinions. I'm a little more conservative, I'm a little more liberal. I think we're actually at a point where I'm a human being with dignity, and you don't see me as human. I mean, I've seen pastors refer to Mexicans as vermin, you know, and that's the same kind of language that was used to dehumanize the Jews, you know, during the Holocaust. Like I think we need to be honest about where we are in our moment in US history, that this isn't just, you know, there's some division because some are left and some are right. Like this is just, there's just right and wrong sometimes. And I think for me, the bottom line, and even when working with different faith communities in organizing, we all have very different theological beliefs and some had different political leanings, but we all agreed that every human being was made in God's image, or that every human being is inherently worthy of dignity and respect. And I feel like that for me is bottom line. And unfortunately, that's controversial. So I have a little bit of trouble with wanting to try and unify everybody. I don't think that is very realistic in this moment.
Adam, there are two questions in the chat for you, and I am going to pose both of them to you. They're two different questions, but I'll pose both of them to you. And then I will come back with a final question for the panel, for the panelists, and we will close our time together. So Adam, the first question is, how can we be intimate with Christ when involvement of social justice is what hurts us? The community in Kentucky are hurt due to the death of Breonna Taylor. Do we need our faith to be of comfort and aid? Do you need me to reread the question, Adam?
No, I think I got it.
Okay, and I'll pose the other question to you while you're sitting with that one. The question is, thank you for the two cautions regarding what the Baptist notion of separation of church and state does not mean becoming apolitical or privatization when it comes to changing systems, as in systematic racism, etc. We can also be tempted to think that the doctrine requires us to be prophetic from outside the system. How do you understand the possible prophetic role that might happen within system, i.e. Marshall or RBG on the Supreme Court, or Obama? In the system opportunities, biblical Joseph, who were prophets from within?
Yeah, thanks for both those questions. So if I understood the first one correctly, and I might not have, or may not be, but how do you be intimate with Christ when social justice can be something that is hurting you or your faith? I'm not sure which it's applied to, but the way I would look at it is that, you know, certainly the lack of social justice breaks the heart of God and should hurt our faith. It should hurt our sense of our connection to others and our connection to God, because at its heart, various forms of injustice, whether it's exploitation or domination or exclusion from community, all violate our relationship with God, are all forms of sin that separate us from God. And so in that sense, I think that it is hard to have that intimacy with God in the presence of injustice. In terms of the specifics of Breonna Taylor's murder and killing, I mean, I think that that has created a understandable and in some ways necessary crisis in the city of Louisville. My mom grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, segregated Louisville, Kentucky. So I have some personal connections to the city. And, you know, while the Black Lives Matter movement has certainly been sparked primarily around the tragic deaths and murders of Black men, there are so many Black women who have also been killed at the hands of police violence that also deserve our activism and our attention and our lament, from Sandra Bland to many others. And so Breonna Taylor, I thought it was, you know, particularly atrocious that the grand jury did not even mention her name, did not even say her name when they decided to charge one of the officers for shooting recklessly into her building, and brought no charges to the other two officers. And we don't have time to get into all the details of the case, but I personally believe, based on what I've seen and my own analysis, that there was a deep miscarriage of justice, and that people should continue to push for justice in that case and beyond. In terms of the second question, which I love, we are called to be advocates for justice in lots of different spaces and places. And I love in particular the example of Esther, who had direct access to the emperor and used her influence at potentially the cost of her life in order to advocate on behalf of her people. She was willing to be confrontational. She was willing to take that sacrifice. And to me, that's a really important example of where many of us, whether we're in corporate spaces or whether we're in NGO spaces or whether we're in civic spaces, can use our influence in order to protect those who are most oppressed, those who are vulnerable in lots of different forms and in lots of different ways. I'll just give you a quick example from my own life. I have mostly spent my life in the context of activism, but I've also kind of on the outside of governments and systems. But I spent a year working in the Obama White House as a White House fellow. And in that year, pushed really hard to try to get the Obama administration to do a lot more to not only talk about combating poverty, but trying to create stronger policies and plans to address the crisis of poverty in the United States. I spent 4 years at an institution that I used to protest, never thought I'd actually work for, which is the World Bank Group. Ended up there because President Obama nominated Dr. Jim Kim to be president of the World Bank. He was someone I got to know many years ago in a lot of my activism around the AIDS crisis, and came in as a change agent, or try to be a change agent within the World Bank, and really get the bank to make a preferential option for the poor the core of its mission and of its work. And so while that work certainly was frustrating in lots of ways and had its challenges, I felt like God was able to use me in those two places in order to try to affect change from the inside. Ultimately, I kind of feel like my long-term calling is to be an advocate from the outside, but I really admire people that try to exercise their faith and be an influence and be an advocate from the inside. We need both. And ideally, you know, the outside and the inside can work together and sometimes be co-conspirators, if you will.
Thank you, Adam. I appreciate it. And so we would like to end the panel with this final question, but I would like to say that the answer from the panelists is the answer that's coming from the panelists, and it's not representative of the American Baptist Home Mission Societies or American Baptist Church. So, but it is a question that is on the heart of many of us, and certainly it's a question that we would love to hear you all engage with. So if you can speak to this collectively. And I am actually going to start with Marie. I know that I just said it is not a question that is specific to American Baptist churches in general, but I would love to begin with you, Marie, as a representative. And so the question reads, what is the role of faith and activism in situations that defied agreed upon laws of the land? Specifically, if the results of the presidential election are not honored, what is the role of faith activists in such a scenario?
I think the word that comes to mind, just picking up on what Adam just said and what I've been convicted about, is the word agency. That we as faith people have been invited by God to participate in the bringing of God's reign here, and you know, not to take our agency in this country as marred as it is right now. Was convicted a couple years ago visiting another country where there really was not a sense of agency under an oppressive government. That I think we take that for granted a lot here. And so to take seriously our agency, our ability to speak up, to speak those things that are of God, to call, as Christina said, right as right, wrong as wrong. And again, drawing upon what has been said, taking the cost of that and being mindful about where we are protective of our own privileges, our own comforts, our own well-being, and noticing when that is preventing us from being mouthpieces for Christ and for God's justice. And doing it in a way that is authentic to the community in which we find ourselves. And so recognizing that that looks very different based on who you are, how God has created you, the community that you are placed in at this moment. And we need to honor each other for doing that in different ways, because we need all the different ways to express activism and faithfulness and discipleship. Shall I invite another? I'd invite Claire.
Wow. Well, I'm not American Baptist, but I will attempt to answer it. I think if the results don't go as we would hope, I would say that we get grassroots once again. I mean, I've seen more grassroots activism since 2016 and the first election of Trump. More people running for office than ever before. I mean, if one good thing came out of it, it's that people realize that no one person in government is going to be our savior, that we've got to do it ourselves at the grassroots level, and we've got to become involved in our local issues. And more people have run for office, women and people of color that, you know, ran for office and won in House of Representatives. And I've seen local pastors here in Nashville who have run for office and just gotten involved. You know, I think there will be certainly moments to protest, but also just realizing that there's still work to do, and we are all invited to participate in that work of bringing justice to our communities and just amplifying voices that need to be amplified. I'm going to invite Christina.
So I think we are approaching a very significant moment. And I think I want to remind folks that this is a long game commitment. I know that earlier this year when the George Floyd protests were happening, I was in a place where I didn't have a vehicle. You know, we're in the middle of the pandemic, and I wasn't able to do what I wanted to do. And so I've been working through a lot of those feelings and realizing that focusing on my last year of school is important at the moment. And this work is going to continue after this. This work is going to be there and just as important as ever in 10 years and in 20 years. And so I think it's important for folks to know that this commitment to civic engagement and social justice is a lifelong commitment, and not just in the moment of this election, voting and then we're done. I think after the results of this election is when we're really going to need to see our community come together in a lot of really creative ways. So I'm thinking of, you know, for folks who can't go anywhere, maybe their personal health, you know, is a priority. If you have the ability to give money to people who are doing the work on the ground, do that. That is just as important. If you have the ability to support a Black trans woman who needs money to pay rent, that is the work. That is also the work. And so I think we need to be creative in thinking about what more we can do. What are your resources? What are your gifts? There's a really quick, I'll just name it. There's a really beautiful resource by Deepa Iyer, or Iyer, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but she lists out these roles. What is your role in the long game? And those roles are caregiver, builder, disruptor, experimenter, frontline responder, guide, healer, storyteller, visionary, and weaver. And if you go to her resource, she describes in detail what those are. But we all have a place in the movement, and we all have a place in supporting one another in community. So yeah, I'll pass it off to Dr. Rindy.
Did you say me? Okay, thank you. So while I agree absolutely about the long game, yes, I mean, you know, in some ways, my wife and I feel like we've been banging our heads against a brick wall for over 30 years, right? But we also have to realize that there are these sort of moments in time where things begin to change. And right now is one of those moments. We are in a very historic moment, a moment that I didn't think I would ever see in my lifetime. And so, and where we are right now, we need to be very clear-headed about it. As leaders, we need to use all the influence we have. But to be clear-headed about it is to realize what's at stake here. What we are experiencing right now is a revitalization movement of white supremacy in our country. I'm glad you gave the disclaimer, Katia, because now I can freely say whatever I want, right? So we are experiencing an assault, a revitalization of white supremacy. It's always been here, but now it's been given, you know, sort of the okay. And not coincidentally, Black, Indigenous, people of color are dying at much higher rates than white folks, right? And you know, being Native American, I would, you know, I would love to say that it's accidental, but also given the history of our treatment in this country, you have to believe that there's somebody sort of involved in either allowing this to go on or planning it, one or the other. And so if we don't change, we are basically voting for more Black, Indigenous, people of color to die, because that is actually what's happening right now. And so we have to get out right now, you sort of like the idea of there's this momentum going. We have to keep the momentum going during this period of time. Be ready to play the long game, that's fine. We got a long game regardless of what happens. But right now we need to use every influence that we can to make the changes that present justice, equality, equity, dignity for all people, because that's what Jesus commands us to do. And who hasn't spoken yet? If you haven't spoken, just chime in, because I can't keep track of that.
I'll jump in, I'll make it quick, which is very un-Baptist of me, but at least Baptist preacher. So I don't always plug magazine articles from Sojourners, but in this case, it's really relevant. The cover article for the November issue was co-written by Dr. Barbara Williams-Skinner and I, and the title is A Roadmap of Moral Resistance. And it is basically laying out at least the beginnings of a strategy of what I think the faith community, not just the church, but the faith community more broadly, should and needs to do in the event of a deeply contested or even stolen election. It is, I was gonna say unbelievable, but in some ways it's not unbelievable. But in any case, it is insidious that the president has basically co-opted the concerns about a rigged or stolen election by alleging it's already happened because of vote by mail without a shred of evidence that there is significant fraud with vote by mail. When, as I tried to explain earlier, the real and more likely cause of a tainted or stolen election is voter suppression efforts that one party in particular has been orchestrating for many election cycles. And so I don't have time to unpack all the different scenarios involved in what we'd have to respond to, everything from the president refusing to leave power if it's clear that he's lost, court cases and lawsuits, ensnaring the election results, and us being into a scenario where we're literally in mid-December before there's a final decision or things going to the Supreme Court. There's lots of different kind of scenarios that we have to be prepared for. But I would just argue that moral resistance from the church in particular is going to be essential. And this is a moment where our democracy literally is at stake. I don't believe we can simply just step aside and just say, we'll just get it right the next time. And we should honor the results. I mean, if Trump does win decisively, I hope all of you will respect and honor those results. But if he loses and clings on to power, or if he wins because of illegitimate means, then I think we have a moral responsibility to speak out, to stand up, and to engage.
Thank you, panelists. And on behalf of the American Baptist Home Mission Societies, I would like to again thank each of you for your time, your energy, and your wisdom. We are grateful for what you have poured out today, and we are indeed blessed by each word that has been spoken. At this time, I would like to extend an invitation for the Reverend Dr. Robin Stoops to come forward.
This has been a great conversation, and I appreciate the panel members very much, the way that they've shared. And it's not good enough for us to just listen. As we've heard, there's also things for us to do. In J.R. Briggs' book, The Sacred Overlap, he reminds us our God is the God of the ampersand. Our God is a God of both and, more than a God of either or. In Revelation 1:8, we're told God is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. We discover we are sinners and saints, more flawed and sinful than we would ever dare to believe, and yet more loved and accepted, more than we could ever have the courage to hope. Abraham met God who needed nothing and yet asked for everything. Moses met the God who was far away and yet was so close. Job met the God who was active and inactive. Habakkuk met the God who was consistent and unpredictable. Jonah met the God who was indiscriminate and selective. Esther met the God who spoke and remained silent. The cross reveals the God who won even as he lost. He is powerful and gentle, transcendent and immanent. God is a God who demands faithfulness and freely forgives. He's a God who, in James, has told us faith alone is not enough. For faith to be genuine, it must be connected to action. So how do we act when we're faced with past, present, and a future most likely steeped in injustice? First, we commit to vote after much prayer, wise counsel, deep study, and wide research, with these words of Jesus ringing in our ears. The Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your understanding, with all your strength. And this is the second one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. We must vote as if our neighbors' lives depend on it. After November 3rd, there are other things we can do for justice in our world. We can continue to pray, of course. We definitely need to continue to denounce racism in all of its forms. We need to learn from people different than us, listening to their stories, hearing their pain and struggles. We need to be aware of the hate around us and in us, and live instead the love that we have available to us through Christ our Lord. We need to build relationships with people different than us. We can open ourselves up to make space for the Holy Spirit to work. God is already at work among us in our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities. We must join that work. We can make a commitment to put our faith in action in our lives and mercy in our hearts, living into the incarnation of the one who so greatly loves us. In James 4:17, we're told, so then if anyone then knows the right thing to do but doesn't do it, it becomes sin for them. It's past time for us. Christ's body, his church, it's past time for us to be active in our communities, to stand against racism and injustice with no compromise. Take the next few days, pray, prepare, vote, and then act as an agent of change, a peacemaker, a good Samaritan, a disciple of Jesus. Amen.
Dr. Stoops, thank you so much. That was indeed a very powerful word, and I thank you for living that example every day. Thank you so much. At this time, I want to invite someone that I had the pleasure of meeting this past weekend, but someone who I think her story is one that will resonate with many of us, and she's someone that I believe will offer some good words to us today. So I'm going to invite Anita to share her story after I read a brief bio about her. In January 2014, Anita began working for the North Carolina General Assembly as a legislative assistant for District 32, where she's still employed today. She has over 20 years of economic and community development experience from her previous positions throughout her career. Prior to becoming a legislative assistant, Anita worked in a volunteer capacity with the North Carolina Department of Administration, North Carolina Council for Women, where she assisted the executive director and grants administrator with processing over $7 million for women's shelters and domestic violence programs throughout North Carolina. Anita Bennett is also the current director of operations for the nonprofit New Life Connection. New Life Connection assists women who have been incarcerated or justice involved and are looking for a new life direction. Helping women who are transitioning has become an important chapter in her life story and is a new life's focus. Anita has many hours of volunteerism with several organizations under her belt. She believes that volunteering is a form of giving back. And so, Anita, I will invite you to share your story. And then after that, I will invite Reverend Dr. Marilyn Turner Triplett to pray for Anita. And lastly, I will invite my colleague, the Reverend Benjamin Sullivan, to close us in prayer. Thanks again for joining us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to say thank you so much. Listening to this webinar has been very enlightening, and I love the fact that you all are really working in the community. First of all, I was incarcerated for 2.5 years, and that 2.5 year incarceration was probably the best 2.5 years of my entire life. One, I got to understand who I am. Two, I got to know who God was. And three, I got to know who I am in God. And that is what set me on a path of working with women who are coming home from incarceration. I also work with their families as well. But the main thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is, for those of you who are leaders in the church, you all do have a responsibility. And one of the things that I became disillusioned with the church about when I was going through my incarceration is that we haven't done a good enough job giving people information. I feel that a lot of our community is perishing because there is a lack of information. We're not doing what we're supposed to do. We're not doing what God is calling us to do. And I work very closely with the women. I do direct services. I also work at the General Assembly, and I often laugh with my family. They don't think it's funny, but I think it's hilarious. I said I came from the big house and started working for the mini White House. And so I get a chance to kind of see how we are really looked upon in the community, those of us who are justice involved, those of us who have had issues with the Justice Department. And one of the things that I've recognized very early on is that we don't deal with the traumas that women and their families go through on a daily basis. And that is why this recidivism rate is so high. And because, of course, we're a litigious community and we think that everything should be punitive. And so I work really closely with the women to connect them with services in the community. And we have some absolutely wonderful programs that we're working with them and helping them determine that there is a new life path, but the life path has to start here. And if it doesn't start here, you can introduce them to every service, every program, you can provide them every resource, it will not matter. If we don't get that mind, if we don't get that spirit, it's over. We're not doing anything. But I heard something in this webinar today that I thought was interesting, and I think it was Claire. And I think you said something about restoring people to the community, and that resonated with me because that is exactly what we should be doing as people of God. And then I think also Dr. Randy said something about if the church would get involved. Now that's a sore point with me, and I appreciate you saying that, because the church has to get involved. That is what God called us to do. And so we are missing in action, and that is why we are where we are today with the political community, with the community period, with our teenagers, with our young people. And so I just feel like God is calling us to do a better job. And there are 22 scriptures in the Bible that talk about walking in boldness. And he's not just talking about the boldness of knowing God, but he's talking about the boldness of the things that we speak. He's talking about the boldness of proclaiming his word and making sure that our citizens, our people that in our community, our families are walking in the word of God. And so it just strikes me that we are in this precipice of which direction do we go in? Well, the only direction that we have to go in is the direction that he already paved the way for. And so we've got to do better. We've got to, my incarceration was interesting because I got a chance to understand the judicial system on both sides, as someone who is part of the judicial system and someone who was within the judicial system. And so again, you'll never ever, if you ever hear me speak, you'll never ever hear me say that I regret the fact that I was incarcerated, because I believe that this was what God allowed me to do in order to see where he wanted me to go. And you cannot, and some of this work you absolutely cannot do unless you've been a part of it. And so I want to thank you all for allowing me to be a part of this, and thank you for hearing your ideas and your thoughts. And there's so much work to do, and it sometimes seems like a daunting task for us, but I believe that God is he is still calling us to work. He's calling us to do the work that he's already paved the way for us to do. And so I just want to thank you all. I appreciate it. And New Life Connection is, we're moving forward. And I'd like to feel like I'm moving forward with you all as well.
Thank you so much. For time's sake, I'm going to defer the final prayer to my colleague, Reverend Ben Sullivan. But prior to doing that, I just want to thank Anita for that powerful sharing, and to remind all of us that this is one more reason that we, as the people of God, people of faith, need to be involved in efforts to restore voting rights to returning citizens, because it is a major issue. We do pray for Anita and so many returning citizens like her. Applaud your courage, and the ministries that are out there working to make a difference. Reverend Ben, I'm just going to invite you to pray us to a close.
As we prepare to close in prayer, I just once more to encourage everyone to live out your faith and civic engagement by exercising your right to vote in the upcoming November 3rd election. So please join me as I pray in English and my Kiowa language. Dear Lord, as we come to the end of this gathering, I just pray that you will bless the people that have come. Lord, bless the leaders and the panelists that have agreed to be with us today. Lord, as they continue their work, Lord, I pray that you'll watch over them, keep them in all their ways. Lord, I pray for the people that have joined as attendees and are being led by the Spirit, Lord, to operate and do the things that you are leading us to do. Lord, I pray that you will just bless them and keep them as well. Dalki badot sai, dalkia badot sai, ma de kakomo, 8 sat he de tano, ba o ta ta. Hey hey kakom da ga on tona aim on taura. Dalkia tongia toy baron. Dalkia tongia toy ba ga oh boy da. Dalkia all dalki bone ma. Ba all te oi ba on. Dalkia te hoy dalki bone ma. Ba all te hoy ba on. Aho daki. Aho dakia. Amen. Thank you.